So the next panel will be moderated by Susan D'Agostino. She's a science writer and mathematician with work published in The Atlantic, Washington Post, Scientific American, Wired, Quanta, BBC, Nature, National Public Radio, Financial Times, and others. She's also technology correspondent for Inside Higher Education, where she provides analysis on pressing issues facing higher education. She is the author of the 2020 book, How to Free Your Inner Mathematician, for which we received the Euler Prize for exceptionally well-written book with a positive impact on the public's view of mathematics from the Mathematical Association of America. This year, she joined Columbia University as a Spencer Educational Journalism Fellow. Here she's working on long-form articles and book examining the acceleration of artificial intelligence with application in the US university life, including potential risks and benefits posed to students and society. Susan, welcome on the stage.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We're thrilled to have you here for this really... Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Can you hear me?
No, still not. I'm not hearing anything either. How many engineers does it take to turn on a microphone?
Check, check.
That works.
Thank you for joining us for this important conversation. How do we ensure that AI benefits humans? I'm honored to have two guests, distinguished guests, joining me today. First, I'll introduce Vinton Cerf, who is the L in the HLF. He is a Turing Award recipient for pioneering work in the internetworking, including the design and implementation of the Internet Communications Protocol, TCP/IP, and he is currently Chief Internet Evangelist at Google. Welcome. And my next distinguished guest is Afua Bruce, who is a leading public interest technologist who works at the intersection of technology, policy, and society. Afua is the principal of the ANB Advisory Group, an adjunct professor at Carnegie Mellon University, and an affiliate at Harvard's Berkman Klein Center. She's also the author of a book that describes how tech can advance equity. Welcome. Okay, so we are just going to dive in because it's a really important topic, and this is one that we are absolutely aiming at all of the young researchers in the audience. So, Vint, I'd like to start with you. You were present at the birth of the internet, and I'm wondering if you can share an example or two in your experience where early pioneers were not able to anticipate some of the risks that emerging technology posed for humanity or for humans. And I'm wondering if you can mine that for any insight that might help our aspiring entrepreneurs and emerging computing researchers so that they might gain some insight from you moving forward.
Well, let me give you a couple of examples. In the very early days of pre-internet, the ARPANET, we encountered networked electronic mail around 1971, about a year or two after the network was put together. And what we discovered very quickly was that it was a social networking component because we started using distribution lists. And the first one I joined was called Sci-Fi Lovers, and we had big fights over who were the best authors. The reason I bring that up is that while we could see the social component, another list was Yum Yum. It was restaurant reviews in Palo Alto. What we didn't foresee, however, was the negative side effects of those sorts of distribution lists, or what we would now call social networking. That wasn't obvious. In fact, one of the biggest nuclear explosions on the net was when an advertisement showed up on a distribution list, but this network was supposed to be only for government research. And the party that put that up was soundly chastised by the operators of the ARPANET because they were paying for that and not paying for it to be used as an advertising tool. So a lot of the problems that you encounter later that you didn't anticipate represent a kind of failure of imagination. You can't always imagine the ways in which people would abuse the thing that you invented. And I certainly didn't anticipate some of the abuse that we see today that we're trying to figure out what to do about. And this is not even talking about the large language models and their hallucinations and misrepresentations and the like. Just people are pretty bad at abusing these things, trying to spread bad misinformation and disinformation. And certainly in the beginning, our primary concern as engineers was to get the thing to work. And so I didn't spend a whole lot of time thinking about how could you wreck it, because I was much more interested in trying to make it work. And the idea that somebody would want to wreck it was sort of, outside of the focus of attention. Now today, it's the other way around. We're all trying to figure out how to keep it from being, the network from being wrecked by people who have reason to want to do that.
So that's such an interesting point. Thanks for that insight. What you're mentioning, the failure of imagination. One thing that I see as a journalist is that sometimes scientists who actually imagine scenarios like, hey, this could be abused in X way, are accused of, oh, that's a sci-fi fantasy, that doesn't, so there's a little tension there, right? Yeah. Because you want to imagine scenarios that, so that we hopefully anticipate problems and rectify them before they happen. But then what happens to the lone scientist who says, wait a minute, let's put the brakes on this? So how do you talk about the gap there?
Let me give you another example. Bob Kahn, my partner in all of this, when we first met, I was at UCLA as a graduate student, and he was working at Bolt, Beranek, and Newman making the ARPANET imps. And we met in early 1970, just after the first 4 nodes of the network had been put together. And he had theories that the thing that they had designed, the routing algorithms and everything, were not going to work. He tried to explain to his colleagues that there were conditions under which it would jam up, it would get overloaded, or totally congested, then no traffic would flow. And his colleagues said, oh, the probability of that happening is the probability of all the oxygen molecules gathering in the corner of the room and we all suffocate. And so he came out determined to demonstrate that it wasn't going to work. So we spent 2 weeks generating traffic in various and sundry ways, killing the network. So that was an example of he had the imagination and the rest of his colleagues didn't. So sometimes you do get, he had to go back and they had to change a lot of the algorithms to correct for the mistakes that had been made that led to these failures. So sometimes it does work the other way. Sometimes you do get someone who recognizes the problem, is rejected by his colleagues. You demonstrate that it actually fails, and then of course they can't duck anymore. They have to respond.
Okay, so maybe persist with that.
Oh well, listen, patience and persistence. If you want to know how you succeed in life, you have to be patient and you have to be persistent.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. Okay, so Afua, you're a public interest technologist, but I'm not confident that everyone in this room knows what that is. So can you explain to us, how do you fill your days? What do you do? What motivates you to do the work that you do?
Absolutely, and the term public interest technology is fairly new, probably 5 or so years old, but it does build on existing work that's gone on for quite some time, especially in the field of STS. But when I think of public interest technology is really looking to apply technology to help develop and realize socially responsible solutions to some of the biggest challenges we're facing today in our society. And so you can think of it as really using technology expertise to promote the public interest and to serve the public good. So essentially interoperability between technology, policy, and society. I am a computer engineer by training. That's what my undergraduate degree is. I worked at IBM as a software engineer all through, I feel like IBM is a wonderful place to start a career as an engineer. So I worked at IBM all through undergrad and after undergraduate as well. And so now the problems that I look at in the work that I do really has to deal with how can we center issues of equity and access and justice into the technology we develop. I've said this, and I've said this to several of you even this week, that there's no naturally occurring river of technology that's out there that we just go pick from. We actively create technology. We actively create the ways that we use technology, and we allow it to be used in our society. And so because of that, we really need to understand how people work with technology and how systems work together. And so also, as you think of public interest technology, you can think of it also as a really explicit interdisciplinary field that combines both technology and non-technology expertise. So my days are filled with talking with philosophers and lawyers and policymakers, as well as engineers and researchers, to think about how are we designing systems better? How are we encountering and getting around some of these unintended consequences with technology? Although, to be frank, anytime we say unintended consequences, we just really mean the same problems that we've seen disproportionately affecting Black and brown people over and over and over again, but we continue to face those. So really having those conversations. My work centers with AI, data science, and cybersecurity.
Okay, great, thank you. So to lay the groundwork for this conversation, we could write a book, we could teach a semester-long course on potential future risks about AI. So we're not going to necessarily go into the future, especially because there are profound disagreements among very highly reputable computer scientists about what those future risks are. Even the three godfathers of AI, Geoffrey Hinton, Yoshua Bengio, and Jan LeCun, disagree about what the future risks are. So let's talk for a moment, and even just high level, 1-2 minutes if possible. What are you concerned about today, in the present, in terms of artificial intelligence impact on humans? So Afua, if you want to begin.
Absolutely. I have spent a lot of my career working with government systems. I worked for the FBI, running some of their science and technology programs for some time. I ran the White House's National Science and Technology Council for a couple of years as well, and over the past couple of years have done a lot of education in the US with state and local government officials on data systems and AI. And so what I am concerned about with AI, let's see where to start. So one of the things I'm concerned about with AI is how quickly we are adopting them to help administer benefits. Different governments are using AI systems and AI tools to administer benefits. I think there's a lot of promise here, and we have seen a lot of successful use cases of where AI has been used to help better streamline fraud detection. The IRS in the US is using it to better target auditing systems, for example, rather than sample audits where you oversample of who needs an audit, using AI to do more fraud detection, basically, to better target that. So I think that's a really good use case. At the same time, when that goes wrong, it can go really wrong. So in Australia, for example, they did something similar with a different implementation, and the system ended up essentially racially profiling people, and they had to walk back. They had to completely walk back their tool there. We've seen different AI systems be used with different medical imaging, and the results from that have automated at scale the preventing of people getting access to medical services. We've seen it go wrong in other cases there. So as we think about how AI is used, because especially in the government system space, the data is often biased, whether intentionally or as the result of prior policies, We can't automate at scale the inability of people to get basic services they need, basic water, basic food, basic housing. And so that misuse really scares me.
Great, thank you. Vint, would you like to comment on what you're concerned about today?
I was just thinking about your comment about access to medical assistance.
Yeah.
I always thought insurance companies, health insurance companies were designed to prevent you from getting treatment, something like that.
I think that's a whole other panel.
And they're getting better at it with the AI system.
Absolutely.
I'd like to make, first, if you'll permit me to make an observation which is not in response to your question.
Of course.
But I was listening to the earlier fantastic panel, and the word semantics popped up eventually in the course of the discussion. And do you remember the story about Plato and the people in the cave and seeing the shadows and so on? It almost felt like the semantics of the large language models are the shadows, and what we're seeing is the words, and the words, in a sense, hold in them the shadowy semantics that the sentences are trying to convey. And that's why it seems to be able to reason, because there is a semantic content and value to the sentences whose statistics we've been capturing. I have no idea whether that's a useful observation or just babble. But
it was an interesting observation.
We enjoy a good tangent. So.
but for some reason that captured my attention. Here's what I worry about. One of the things that Margot brought up is that the uncritical use of these technologies without understanding that they have fragility. The lawyer that had a pleading generated by a bot, which included a made-up reference to something that didn't exist, and the judge was not amused, as I understand it. And so this uncritical inability to even imagine what you should do about how you should use these things worries me. There's a second thing that's happening that is related. The bots are trained on material which is accumulated in the internet, on the World Wide Web. And the concern that people have about what they consider abuse of that content may lead to a kind of disconnection that happens where the content on that becomes less and less accessible. But the whole purpose of setting up the World Wide Web was to share information, not to hide it behind walls. And so I worry that there may be a side effect of the current large language model generation that actually denies access to useful information in a harmful way.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you for both sharing some of your present concerns. And the list could go on a little bit longer. So given that there are present concerns, I spoke recently with Turing Award recipient Yoshua Bengio, and I have forthcoming stories in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and also I'll have some in Inside Higher Ed as well with his insight. But he shared with me that his concern that universities, higher education, is not necessarily teaching emerging computing researchers or aspiring entrepreneurs ethics alongside the technical expertise that these individuals need. I'm wondering what your view is. So, Afua, if you want to start.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. A lot of programs, especially when we look globally, a lot of technical programs, computer science, computer engineering specifically, do not require ethics. And if they do, there are very few programs that embed ethics sort of throughout the curriculum. It can often be one course at the end. I know in my own grad school, even my ethics class in grad school, we could take an ethics or a law class or something else and at the end of our studies, and that was fine. I've done other studies since then, it's fine. And so I do think that is an issue. I think that as we think about how to design the systems, the people, you all, who are doing this research, who are designing these systems, when you intimately know how they are created, you could have a really good understanding of what we can do, but also what we shouldn't do. And so I think that's why ethics education is really important. I think that there are a number of programs across the world that are doing this really interestingly. One program out of Harvard, but that curriculum is being used also across the world as the Ethics CS curriculum, so I think that's being seen more often. I think we're also starting to see demand from students for these courses as well, which is really exciting to me. The next level I would like to see is some push from industry as well to value this type of training in the type of students and graduates that they hire.
Okay, great. Vint, would you like to add to that?
You know, I'm not sure ethics is something you can teach.
Okay.
It's something you can learn, but I would distinguish between those two and argue that it's something you practice. And what we need, I think, is more immersion in an environment where ethics is visible. You want to have a social norm that guides you in those ethical ways. Now, sometimes, going to Sunday school was a way of learning ethics because you learned about what you weren't supposed to do. And maybe we need more of that. But I think of ethics training as some of the kinds of things that companies try to they make you take an online course and you have to answer a few questions and you get done after an hour. Okay, so you're now ethical.
Right.
Right. Wouldn't it be great if there was just complete this checklist once in your life and now you're ethical forever?
Yeah, something
like we could do that.
Yeah, and then this is the concern, because I don't have the answer, actually. I don't, I'm not saying we need to quarantine it over in some online course, 1 hour, you're done. But
by the way, I don't think either of us are disagreeing. We want people to think about ethics.
Yes.
And by the way, this is not just about AI, and it's certainly not about large language models. Every programmer that writes a piece of software has an ethical responsibility to make sure that it works. And if it doesn't work, you have a responsibility to fix it, particularly if people are going to be depending on it. My daily nervous moment is when I get into one of those elevators where you say which floor you want to go in, and it says go to elevator B. So you get in elevator B, and there are no controls there at all. You're relying on somebody else's software. And I used to make a living writing software, and I know how easy it is to create bugs and how hard it is to find them. Yeah. And even just talk about ethics for a second. If you have a programmer who wrote the program and make the programmer responsible for finding the bugs, sometimes that's the wrong thing to do. What you want is for someone to test the program who didn't write the software, because they'll try stuff out that the programmer will implicitly avoid because he or she implicitly knows that that's not going to work, so you don't test that part. So having, the ethics of program testing might turn out to be an important, actionable training.
Absolutely. And I think there was actually, sorry, just building on that, I think IBM in 2019-ish, it was pre-pandemic times, who knows what year it was, but published a paper on translating ethics into practice for AI specifically, and talked about some of that, how you need to have it tested by not the programmers, by people who are not technical.
Well, what happens when software finally gets out there in the wild? Those are all people who are not programmers.
It's very true.
And they find ways of using your software that you never anticipated.
It's 100%
didn't think of.
true.
Yeah. And so that's a great test, but it's also potentially hazardous, especially if it causes a problem.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, you're both bringing up great points, and I actually share your point of view that that there are limitations when we actually try to, put it on a syllabus and, assign credit to it. So I think what I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think what I'm hearing is that what higher education really should be aiming for is this culture of ethics, that emerging computer scientists should come of age in a setting where those questions are being asked alongside, okay, I have a great idea, a great tech idea, I want to run with it. So how, is there a role that higher education can play, or is this, is this kind of emotional education beyond it?
Well, first of all, remember that this education takes place within the context of a society. Mm-hmm. And if you look around the world, you'll find societies have different levels of ethical concerns. Or certain things are accepted practice in some societies and they're not in others. And so we even make rules up to deal with that problem. For example, in the United States, it's illegal to use bribery as a way of pursuing your business. And if you're caught with that, regardless of where the bribes are being paid, there are penalties for that. So this takes us back to the question of incentives. And if you want things to be ethical, then there had better be incentives for ethical behavior. Sometimes those can be negative incentives, like if we catch you, there will be consequences. And others, there might be a reward there for ethical behavior. But we do have to pay attention to incentives. And if you don't like what you're seeing, if you don't like the behavior you're seeing, figure out what the incentives are for driving that behavior. Figure out if there's another incentive that would drive different behavior, and then figure out if you can get that incentive in place.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to turn that back to a question for both of you. Does higher education have the right incentives in place for computer science majors or those who are taking computer science classes?
I think that higher education could use more incentives to do that. So to my earlier point that I would like to see employers really reward and explicitly search for people who have understanding of ethics, who have some demonstrated understanding of ethics through their curriculum, but really through the work that they've done. I think that that would strengthen some of the incentives for academia. Through some of the work we're doing at Carnegie Mellon now, we're interviewing a number of industry professionals for what they are looking for from students who are graduating with various degrees, with AI concentrations. And it was really interesting because I think in 2 or 3 of those conversations, we explicitly asked, well, in all the conversations, we explicitly asked, do you hire for ethics? Do you ask about ethics? And a couple of the industry executives said, I never ask about ethics in the interviews. But then some went further to say, I never ask about ethics, but I will ask someone if you are designing, if I ask someone in an interview, design this program for me, tell me how you would design this particular button. If they aren't telling me what the societal impacts are, if they aren't telling me who might be hurt by it, if they aren't telling me what could go wrong, then I'm not going to hire them and I'm not moving them forward in the process. And so I thought that was interesting because what they're describing is, I would argue, ethics, but they don't term it as ethics, I think, because industry hasn't said that they explicitly value it. But it's clear that more and more companies are starting to select from, in their interview process, the behaviors that we would associate with ethical or responsible technology.
Well, there might be one incentive for a company to want ethical employees, and that's reputational damage. If you are seen as unethical as a company, that can be quite damaging to your interests, business interests. And so that can be one way of improving the incentive.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So I want to open it up to some of the young researchers, but before I do, is there anything you wanted to share that I did not bring up that you'd like to bring up now?
I'd say the only thing I'd want to add is that we've talked a lot about the application of technology now, and I know a lot of people here, though, may not be looking to go immediately into industry or into politics or into government, but I would just encourage you to think about how you can change or how you can incorporate some of these questions in the research you do. So thinking about how to research around mitigating bias, responsible algorithms, and more, I think is really important. And I think industry, academia, and more are really looking for people who can propose solid technical solutions to some of these challenges.
So just to riff off of that, for those of you who are in the computer science world, you surely have observed that people in the world are increasingly relying on software and on computers to do everything. And I think all of us who are in the business of creating those tools have an enormous ethical responsibility to make those tools safe to use, for some value of safe. That could mean security, it could mean privacy, it could mean avoiding harm and all those other things. And so I hope that you'll incorporate that concern into your thinking in the design, implementation, test, deployment, and repair of the software that we're all relying on. In the medical field, they talk about doing research to cure diseases. One of the incentives is you might get that disease, and it would be nice, or someone you care about might, and the cure might be very important to you. Well, you may be relying on a piece of software written by somebody you don't know, and it would be nice to think that that person had your best interests in heart, at heart, when that software got implemented and deployed. And I would say that the large language model focus of attention right now has us all looking at a particular brand of software that we may decide to rely on more and more, and the questions that will come up are, how could we harm ourselves or others by misusing these tools?
Great, thank you. Okay, so we'd like to open it up. I see a hand over here in the center.
Microphone is on the way.
Thanks so much for a really interesting panel. I would like to pose a question around technology release, which has been quite a hot debate in the AI space. So responsibility around release. Is it responsible to release if it's not well developed? And maybe for the benefit of people in the audience that don't follow the debates around ethical AI so much, like one particular incident that's happened recently was that in a village in Spain, there were some boys who took social media images of girls in their class and basically used generative AI to remove all the clothing. So that's just like one of many instances that has happened. So as veterans in the space and people who thought a lot around prior technologies, I'd love to hear how you view this question of technology release. When can and should it be released?
My first reaction, honestly, is that we cannot assure that there won't be an abuse of the technologies that get released. It's very hard to imagine sometimes the ways in which technology will get used. And even if there are harmful things that could be done with the technology, there may also be incredibly useful things. And so we have this tension between making the software available because it can be used in a positive and constructive way and not releasing it because there might be some bad use. I'd like to suggest a slightly different perspective for a moment. It's not I would say, rather than a binary decision, a more interesting way of thinking about this is risk factors. And so if there's an application that uses artificial intelligence which doesn't have much risk, example, entertainment, a chatbot can be quite entertaining, and usually that's not harmful. On the other hand, if you use similar technology to obtain financial advice or medical diagnosis or treatment or something, you're up in a high risk space. So we might want to think about how to release software. If there's going to be a potential high risk, then there ought to be comparable extra testing, warnings, other kinds of things. Please don't use this without getting a little training even. Sometimes I talk about the internet driver's license because I want people to know that online there are potential hazards and harms, just like we teach teenagers that not everybody is a safe driver, and you should be prepared for that. I'm not really suggesting that we should issue licenses, but I think you should get the training for use of internet and its applications, and that would include the bots and some of the other artificial intelligence tools that we have. But I would like to avoid the idea that we would never release anything until it's absolutely 100% safe, because I don't think that we'll ever get there. What we need is intelligent use of artificial intelligence.
Absolutely, and first of all, I'm thinking about what it would mean to have a bunch of elementary school students in class training for their internet licenses. I think that could be fun. But I completely agree with what you've said, Vint. I think You know, we can even take a look at sort of ChatGPT and some other tools, other generative AI tools that are out there, and what it's looked like to put some guardrails on use. So ChatGPT has specific topics that it won't answer. If you ask it questions about how to deploy a nuclear weapon, or to give you some mental health counseling.
But have you noticed how you can jailbreak these things by saying, pretend that, you know,
this is true. This is true. You can definitely jailbreak anything. And from my time at the FBI, trust me, I know people will try anything on any systems.
Yes.
So there are always ways to do that. But I think to some of what you were saying, and to certainly what I'm suggesting, is that we should put in some guardrails for some of the basic things. So about some violence, for example, and things like that. There are other implementations of generative AI tools. I was looking at a X thread this morning. About an open source AI tool that had none of those. And so the person was describing how it would easily tell you ways to commit suicide, to eradicate underrepresented minorities into other tools. And so I think before releasing something like that, some of these general areas, we should consider putting some guardrails around those.
I think that we will have to ask the AI experts in the room, and I see a hand up over there, the AI experts in the room, whether we even know how to fashion guardrails for these technologies. I'm not sure.
Another great research question.
I think the foremost thing we lack is Asimov's third rule of robotics. Machines must obey people. And you're standing here talking about how to design machines to tell people what they can and can't do. And if we want to lose the war with the machines, that is the big first step.
He didn't need the microphone.
So this is Whitfield Diffie speaking, another Turing Award recipient. Did you want to comment farther?
No.
Okay.
No.
It's true. You know, that's one of the things my co-author and I wrote a lot in our book, is that technology should always be in service of people, regardless of what technology we're talking about.
Well, the unfortunate implication of that statement, I mean, think about what she said. She said technology should always be
in service
of people. The problem is that this hammer that I am holding here can pound nails and it can pound heads. It's serving what I decided I wanted it to do. So we better be a little careful about which service you wanted the technology to serve.
This is true, and I feel like now we're going back to the need for ethics.
Actually, and I would add, I like this idea of having some kind of, aspirational, generalized goal in, when we approach, developing these technologies. But I also appreciate Vince's point that, maybe we have to be really careful about the words that we choose. Do you have an edit for that, Vint, for example?
Yes. We can come out with a second edition of the book.
Some guiding principle that young researchers might take.
I'm not sure that I have a guiding principle. I will tell you that it does get a little crazy. For example, you will find manufacturers of things putting long lists now for protective reasons of saying, don't do the following things. They leave off the don't do this thing, you idiot, like don't sit in the tub with the hairdryer plugged in because you might electrocute yourself. There are long lists of things like that. And those are attempts to warn people about bad things. I will say one other thing, that, going back to the ethics training question, sometimes the best way to learn things is to learn by example. And I really like the idea of telling stories that illustrate what is ethical and what is not ethical behavior, as opposed to having a set of rules. Because sometimes we respond better to stories than we do to a set of rules that we're supposed to follow.
You're making me, go ahead.
I was going to say, Boston University, in their data science and ethics program, they are doing a lot of that, of articulating the stories, documenting them, taking students through those scenarios, and then sharing some of those scenarios out. So I think we're seeing more and more of those real practical examples of what's the story, what's the implication, how do you work through it? I think we're also seeing an increase across academia, and a few years ago helped launch the Public Interest Technology University Network, which is now about 60 universities around the world, and they continue to be one of my biggest clients. And so also looking through that network alone, we're seeing an increase in the number of really ethics-based cases that go through and say, here is an actual development problem, here is the development environment that happened, here's where different decision-making points were along the process, and then sharing those also through the network. So just to your point, I think we're starting to see an increase in these story-based education to get.
Let me give you an analog for a moment. I care a great deal about accessibility. I'm hearing impaired. That's why I'm wearing the headset, in case you're wondering that I'm not listening to the baseball game or something. What's hard to do for programmers is to imagine what they should do with the user interfaces to make them accessible for a blind person or a hearing impaired person or a motor impaired person, cognitively impaired. And of course, the varieties and variations of those impairments are significant, and so you can't really imagine every possible thing. But I have discovered, rather than trying to give someone a formula that says, if you do this, 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 and this, magic happens and it's accessible, I found it much more powerful to show a design which was inaccessible, show a design which is accessible, explain why those two things, why this works and that doesn't. Example, sometimes people will show charts and graphs with colors to distinguish various things, but if you're colorblind, that doesn't help much. On the other hand, if you include shapes and distinguish among shapes and let shape and color be the two ways in which the distinction is made, or texture, then that works for both a person with color blindness and a person who sees normally. And this learning by example is really powerful. We should try to teach ethics the same way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sorry, just quickly, the example you were just giving reminds me of the book Design Justice by Sasha someone. But it is an excellent resource for some of these questions.
Somebody do a Google search.
Exactly. Design Justice is an excellent resource for that.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah, and you're making me think also about business schools often use case studies, so maybe that's a model.
That's also helpful.
Great.
I see a hand up right there with an expert.
Question right here in the third row.
Hi, great talk, by the way. So, in this talk, we came up with, it was mentioned that, ethics is not something static and it changes across the different cultures, different boundaries, but these softwares are international. How do you encode ethics in these softwares which will cross these, different cultural, geographical boundaries? Well,
from the software point of view, sometimes we can make things work across all the, kind of ethical landscape. I mean, I'm thinking, how about self-driving cars? I think rule number one should be don't hit anything, and then all else follows. So sometimes we can establish rules that will work across cultures, but you're right, varying cultures will view unethical behavior in different ways, and that can be surprising and unexpected. We had a hand up right here in the front row, which I think is pretty important.
And sorry, just wanted to add to that just really quickly, because I see now we have a lot of hands going up and not a lot of time. But wanted to point you to the resource. It's called Advancing Racial Literacy in Tech it's a white paper by Mutali and Konde and Jesse Daniels, who were both at Harvard at the time, that talked about at least the software and racial norms. And how to adjust those in technology as software expands globally.
Could we get?
Yeah, Anil?
Anil? Sanjeev, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, Sanjeev.
Yeah.
I'm very sorry.
Yeah, thanks for taking the question. The quick comment I had was that we're talking about very intelligent agents at this point. I don't know if you've heard about things like constitutional AI. You list 12 rules for the agent, and then just let it do self-reflection in some rounds. And that trains it to be more ethical. So these are really intelligent systems, and once you start talking about ethics for them, it's not clear to me that it's as simple as, accessibility kinds of things. And so, in our lives, or in society, we've thought about these for thousands of years, and still don't have agreement. And so maybe there's not enough time to hash all of that out. I mean, that's the fear.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, there's a rebuttal. There's a rebuttal over here. I'm really curious to hear
kind of following
that.
up on that.
Yeah.
First off, I think like much of that what we're seeing with powerful technologies is that they're actually acting as a bigger and bigger magnification glass for problems that we used to have beforehand, independent of the respective technologies.
Yeah.
It's just making it easier or more apparent.
Absolutely.
And with that magnifying also that we beforehand didn't have a reasonable mitigation strategy or did not implement them the way that we should have actually done. For instance, with social networks, for instance, beforehand. Nobody cares with what technology you put crap into the world, it's there, and it's then just getting multiplied by the millions. We should have sort of catered to that beforehand. And the second thing is, like, I think the most critical problem will eventually become us coming to an agreement what we actually would want to have as a society and whatnot. If I'm all for thinking about guardrails there, for instance, with this technology, but I see this as a critical point, even not going across societies within the same society. If you think about the blue and the red states, agreeing on very fundamental things starts to become really problematic. And thousands of years, within the last couple of months or years, we see sort of issues in that direction. And the last thing is ethics. Does it make you more ethical to know about ethics? I mean, Bashar al-Assad studied in the West. Did it make him a full-up Democrat, having studied here? I mean, with that, I'm all for like teaching computer scientists how that should actually work out. But with a lot of money and so on all about, I guess we also need sort of people to look up for that actually showed like ways to actually go about. And with that, it's not just sufficient to know, like, it can be dangerous. You could break things, but you need to be brave to swim against the stream in that case.
Yes to all of those points. I think there's been some interesting research that ethics trading doesn't necessarily correlate to actually more ethical behavior when people are in workplaces, back to, I think, Vince's point about incentives, and to your first point about these systems amplifying what exists. Racism, sexism, ableism, other isms didn't become invented with large language models. They've been around for a while, and it's because how we've designed a lot of the AI systems to amplify what our data shows, which have all of these problems. We can now see it at scale. And I think for me, the issue then back to the government systems that I first brought up is when they operate at scale and they can really then at scale and without human intervention prevent people from living their lives.
I think that's a good place to close. Go for it.
No, I think this is the beginning of a conversation, really. So I appreciate both of you. Let's just thank our guests.